Tonight on War Stories.
You do your worst, and we will do our best.
He saw so many things before other people did.
The public face, fearless.
Victory. Victory at all costs.
The word they believed was Churchill's word.
But privately,
you could hear tears in his voice, and sometimes one even trickled down his cheeks.
The life and times of Winston Churchill. That's next on War Stories. This is Chartwell, home to one of history's greatest leaders, a man who did his best in the worst of times, Sir Winston Churchill. I'm Oliver North. This is War Stories. We're less than 40 miles from the center of London in the verdant rolling hills of Kent. For more than 4 decades, this country home was a haven for one of the free world's most important figures. A man best known today for having stood up to Hitler, personified resilience, and served as a beacon of hope in Britain's darkest hours. What many people don't realize is this iconic Englishman was in fact half American. His public life, which spanned more than 50 years, was a dramatic combination of success and failure, of triumph and tragedy. Stay with us as War Stories looks at the life and times of Winston Churchill.
I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat.
Had it not been for Adolf Hitler, Winston Churchill would not be a household word throughout the world.
When Hitler was elected and appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933, few could imagine the horror that lay ahead. But Winston Churchill knew otherwise.
After the slaughter of the First World War, everyone stuck their head in the sand.
Winston Churchill shares more than just a name with his legendary grandfather. He's also been a member of Parliament.
He was convinced that this war could be stopped without a shot fired.
He saw so many things very, very clearly, and he also saw them before other people did.
As a child and a young woman, Celia Sandys often found herself on the arm of a great man who she simply knew as Grandpapa.
You traveled with him a great deal.
The first journey I did with him was an incredible one. It was in 1959, and it was on the Onassis yacht. And we sailed from Monte Carlo all the way to Istanbul.
The tranquil waters Churchill sailed in the Mediterranean were a lifetime in legacy from the ominous days of 1934. That year, 45-year-old Adolf Hitler became Germany's all-powerful Führer.
Everything was building up in Germany, and my grandfather was absolutely frantic and telling Britain that we weren't sufficiently armed, and no one wanted to hear.
As Hitler ascended to power, 60-year-old Winston Churchill's 3-decade-long political career seemed over. He was mired in what was later called his wilderness years.
In terms of his moral strength and courage, the wilderness years, when he was out of office, out of favour, where he could count his political friends and allies in Parliament on the fingers of one single hand, to me, were his finest hour.
Churchill's career up to that point had been remarkable by any standard, but he felt his destiny was unfulfilled. Winston Spencer Churchill was born on 30 November 1874, at the height of the Victorian era, marked by a strict formality and rigidly divided social classes. Young Winston found himself ensconced at the top of society.
Sir Martin, how many books have you written about Winston Churchill?
About 30, I think.
Sir Martin Gilbert is Winston Churchill's official biographer.
From his childhood, he'd wanted to be a politician, and he'd lived in the world of politics. In his father's home, he met all the political leaders and political figures of the day.
His father, Lord Randolph, was an astonishing figure, like a meteor in the sky. He flashed across the sky.
Nicholas Soames is the son of Winston Churchill's youngest child, Mary. Like his grandfather, he's been a member of Parliament for more than 2 decades. Lord Randolph's life and public service may have inspired Winston, but he was no loving father.
Lord Randolph was not a nice man. He didn't mean to be horrid, but he was.
What drove him?
It might have been the admixture of American revolutionary blood, possibly even a little Iroquois blood, from his mother.
Lord Randolph, he married this remarkable American woman, Jenny Jerome.
Brooklyn-born Jenny Jerome was considered one of the most beautiful women of her day. The daughter of a New York banker, the intelligent and independent Jerome even adorned her left wrist with a tattoo of a snake. Obviously not your typical aristocrat.
And the fact that she was American must have played a huge part in how he was. And if you listen to the way he spoke, he didn't have this very upper-class English accent that you hear with other people, with the clipped tones and all that.
He worshipped his mother.
But in Victorian England, aristocrats didn't raise their children.
My grandmother was really brought up by Mrs. Everest, his wonderful nanny.
And when she died, he said she was the dearest friend that I had for the first 20 years of my life. It was to her I poured out all my many troubles.
At age 7, young Winston was shipped off to boarding school. At 13, he transferred to Harrow, where he remained a hit-or-miss student. His grades made admission to top-tier universities like Oxford or Cambridge unlikely. So he set his sights on Sandhurst, Britain's West Point. It took 3 attempts before he was finally accepted into the cavalry.
It brought about one of the most crushing rebukes that any father has ever delivered.
At the time, the cavalry meant much lower prestige than the infantry.
Unless you mend your ways, you'll end up just another public school failure and a social wastrel, and will eke out a miserable existence to the end of your days. He wanted to be worthy of his father, and that, I think, drove him.
Despite his father's doubts, Churchill remained ever the optimist.
He, very early on, had a great belief in himself. He said to one of his early girlfriends, "We are all worms, but I do believe that I am a glowworm."
Churchill's father died on 24 January 1895, just 4 weeks before Winston graduated from Sandhurst and joined the army.
After his father's death, for the next decade, his mother did everything for him and was a fantastic solace. As he said once, in order to help me, she left no stone unturned and no cutlet uncooked.
My grandmother wanted particularly to prove to himself and to other people that he was very brave.
Winston Churchill, the young soldier, fought across 5 continents, all the way from the northwest frontier of India to Sudan, where he took part in the last great cavalry charge of history.
Winston Churchill left the army in 1899. Hoping his combat experience would bolster his reputation, he made a run for Parliament and lost. Undeterred, he found work as a war correspondent for London's Morning Post.
He was in South Africa in the Anglo-Boer War, and he was taken prisoner and escaped with a price of £25 on his head for his recapture, dead or alive.
His escape became a point of tremendous national enthusiasm. Suddenly, he was the man of the hour.
His heroics got him elected to Parliament in 1900 as a member of the Conservative Party. 4 years later, the 30-year-old Winston Churchill caused political turmoil when he switched to the Labour Party in a dispute over taxes. That year, he met 19-year-old Clementine Hosier. They married 4 years later on 12 September 1908.
My grandmother was an absolutely formidable woman.
She understood him. She was able to guide him sometimes when he became vexed or irate or disconsolate.
In 1911, Churchill was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, putting him in charge of Britain's Royal Navy. It was in this post that he was blamed for one of history's biggest military blunders, Gallipoli. Churchill hatched the plan for the 1915 amphibious invasion of Turkey. The aim? Knock the Ottoman Empire, a German ally, out of World War I. It ended in disaster. Forced to withdraw, the British-led Allied troops suffered more than 46,000 dead and 200,000 wounded. A disgraced Churchill resigned his government post and took command of a battalion in the trenches on the Western Front.
He's convinced that his political career is in ruins. And at that time, somebody in the smartest club in London, White's Club, bet another member that Mr. Winston Churchill will never again hold public office.
just ahead on War Stories.
He had all this incredible anxiety, worry and challenges during the 30s to try to convince the world what was happening.
With the slaughter at Gallipoli hanging over his head, Winston Churchill returned home to England and his wife and 3 children in May 1916. The controversy made his prospects for a new government post decidedly bleak.
Who is his solace in that very dark time?
His solace was painting. He started with his kids' paint box, and then he went on with oils, and he could, as he would put it, assault a canvas for hours and not think of anything else.
Churchill still had some admirers. One of them was the Liberal Party's Prime Minister, Lloyd George, who named him Minister of Munitions in 1917. 7 years later, his political career was flourishing. He even returned to the Conservative Party in 1924. By 1929, he was the father of 5 and Chancellor of the Exchequer, Britain's head of the Treasury. It was one step away from the Prime Ministry. He'd also become the proud owner of a British country estate, Chartwell.
Chartwell was the place that he loved best in the whole world.
Located in Kent, Chartwell cost the Churchills £5,000, about $22,000, when they bought it in 1922.
Judith, what did Mrs. Churchill think of Chartwell?
I think her attitude was affected by the fact that Winston didn't really consult her before he bought it. He bought it and then told her.
Judith Seward is a manager at Chartwell, now a museum.
But I think she had great affection for the place, really. She did have a strong sense of the state of their finances, probably a better one than he had. And she knew that this was really making quite a hole in their finances.
Their wallet suffered another blow in 1929 when Churchill lost his Chancellor post after the Labour Party won at the polls. He remained a member of Parliament, but money was tight.
He basically keeps his family together, making speeches and writing.
The pen is what gave him the power to continue in politics. He got his money from writing his books and from eventually more than one article every week, newspaper article. And this enabled him to maintain his wonderful house, Chartwell.
In the course of his lifetime, Churchill would have 40 titles published in over 60 volumes. In 1931, as America weathered the Depression, he was earning at least £10,000, roughly $45,000, lecturing in the United States. The tour nearly turned fatal in December. Churchill was looking the wrong way while crossing Fifth Avenue in New York and was struck by a car. In this photo, the banged-up Brit is being released from Lenox Hill Hospital after a week's stay. Back home, an unpopular Churchill soon turned his attention to what he considered a threat to Europe's freedom, Nazi Germany.
When does he first see Hitler as the threat?
Already by 1933. By the time that he actually comes to power, he was warning of the dangers of Nazi Germany.
He had all this incredible anxiety, worry and challenges during the 30s to try to convince the world what was happening.
And they branded him a warmonger for his trouble.
Despite Churchill's warnings, little was done to counter the Nazis' rising power. In an effort to avoid war, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler in September of 1938. Germany was allowed to occupy a part of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland.
Did he call Munich appeasement?
Oh, absolutely.
Chamberlain characterized the Munich Agreement as peace with honor. Churchill likened it to feeding a crocodile in the hopes that he eats you last.
How does he deal with his frustration?
He deals with his frustrations by an incredible series of parliamentary speeches, setting out the situation as he sees it. And slowly and steadily, he wins more and more adherents in the parliament and in the country. He was climbing a mountain, and more people were following him.
The Nazis seized the rest of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939. Late that summer in France, an anxious Winston Churchill dabbed at a canvas.
Suddenly Winston looked up from his painting and said, "This is the last picture we will paint in peace for a very long time." And indeed it was.
With Hitler poised to invade England, Winston Churchill looks across the pond for help. That's next on War Stories. September 1939. Churchill is proven right. The Germans invade Poland. It's the beginning of World War II. While America watched, Britain, France, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand declare war on Germany. But the Nazi conquest of Europe was, for now, an unstoppable force.
My grandfather was swept to office by a tide of public feeling that Chamberlain's policy has failed, and we've got to have somebody who will confront the challenge of the hour.
10 May 1940, the Nazis invade France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. A concerned King George summoned Churchill.
The king said to him as he came in, "I don't suppose you know why I've sent for you." And Churchill said with his wonderful beaming smile, "No, sir, I've no idea." And of course, "Please, will you be Prime Minister and form a government?"
My grandfather wrote of his feelings as he lay his head down on the pillow that night. "I felt as if I was walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and this trial. I slept the sleep of the just."
How old is he?
65 years old, as he put it, qualified to draw the old age pension.
On his first day as Prime Minister, he delivered a challenge.
I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering.
They were stark, honest words. Survival was at stake. But even in this bleakest of times, he was a beacon of hope.
You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs.
June 1940. With continental Europe under Hitler's control, the Allies are forced to evacuate from the French town of Dunkirk. Over 335,000 Allied troops made it across the Channel to England, but most of their equipment lay abandoned in France.
And yet, my grandfather was able to persuade the British nation that not only could we hang on, but ultimately we could win this war.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender.
Churchill closed this speech with a thinly veiled plea for help from America and FDR.
In God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old.
People believed that this deliverance would come, and the word they believed was Churchill's word.
England was going to fight, and I wasn't going to be there.
English-born but Canadian-raised, Elizabeth Nell was 22 years old when war erupted in Europe. She was determined to get in the fight, but she was stuck in British Columbia.
So I wrote, "Please, could I have permission to cross the Atlantic? I want to help with the war." But a gentleman at the other end of this wrote back and said, "No, I'm very sorry, you can't. We're not letting any girls cross the Atlantic at the moment."
German U-boats were decimating convoy after convoy, but Elizabeth wasn't afraid, and she didn't give up. Eventually, she was given permission to make the trip.
And we went all the way across the Atlantic like this. Zzz, 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 zzz. And we missed all the U-boats, and they missed us. And so I got back to England.
But Hitler's Luftwaffe got there first.
I was aware that I was going to be shocked at what had been happening in London. People's homes, the front being blown right off. I wanted to be part of it.
And be a part of it she would.
I went to that famous door.
When Elizabeth Nell was hired to be Churchill's secretary, she came here to 10 Downing Street and went to work for one of the world's most demanding bosses.
Winston Churchill had a loving heart, and we all know that conquers all.
That's next on War Stories.
If we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age.
As 1940 drew to a close, Britain, led by Winston Churchill, was alone and desperate. But to most Americans, the war was Europe's problem.
Does he understand the anti-war opposition in the United States?
He does, but I get the impression that he really believes that FDR is looking for any excuse to enter the war.
She was very worried about revealing to Roosevelt the extent of Britain's weakness, particularly as British intelligence was reading the cables being sent by that terrible defeatist, Joseph Kennedy, the American ambassador in London. He said, for goodness sake, don't send them arms because this stuff will fall into German hands.
In public, Churchill maintained a defiant bulldog persona, but privately, he was deeply concerned.
On one occasion, when he was going into Downing Street, a group of workmen saw him and cheered. And normally, he would turn and give them a V sign or go up and talk to them. But instead of doing that, he was fumbling with the key, opening the door frenetically. And Churchill turned and his whole face was covered in tears. And he said, there's nothing I can do for them. They have such faith in me. But he didn't dare face them because at that moment, he felt the situation was hopeless.
Throughout 1941, almost 20,000 British civilians were killed by Nazi bombs. Still, Churchill was a beacon of hope.
Today, every politician has a stable full of speechwriters. Who was your grandfather's speechwriter?
Well, he was a very remarkable man called Winston Spencer Churchill. My grandfather would devote 1 hour of preparation to every minute of delivery. So a 30-minute speech would take 30 hours of preparing it.
We will have no truce or parley with you or the grisly gang who work your wicked will. You do your worst, and we will do our best.
He woke up at 8 o'clock in the morning normally, and then his breakfast was taken into him, and he would stay sitting in bed, and one of his personal secretaries must have been behind the typewriter, which was just near his bed. That was from 8:30 until 1. Then he would get up and have a bath and get dressed and either go to his meeting or receive his visitor.
Dinner followed, and then it was back to work until the wee hours of the morning.
However late you stayed up with him, being the only woman in his bedroom sometimes, Mr. Churchill wasn't like that. We never had any fears about working late for him.
But on her first night, she stumbled out of the starting blocks.
Oh dear, I hate this part of the story. It was not a success. Everything must be in double spacing. He didn't like to see it all crowded up together. I started typing, and somebody else had been using that typewriter and had left it at single spacing. After a bit, he came behind the typewriter to see how I was getting on, and he just sort of burst. "What on earth are you doing it like that for?" So I sat up very straight and said, "I'm very sorry, Mr. Churchill. I've made a mistake." And I heard him say, "The mug, the idiot, the bloody fool." And then he swung round on me and he said, "Send me somebody who knows how to do my work right the first time." You know, I can still hear that in my mind.
For Churchill, Pearl Harbor changed everything.
What was your grandfather's reaction?
Well, his reaction, you know, it may sound a sort of callous thing to say, was thank God.
He felt that now we were going to win, even if it took time, but we were going to win.
During the war, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin met to determine the Allied course of action. These summits produced some of the war's most famous images. But for Elizabeth, they were much more than photo ops.
I longed to be able to go too, because they'd never taken one of the female staff. And I put a note in his black box. And when Mr. Churchill saw this, he said, well, I don't see why she shouldn't go if she wants to.
Elizabeth Nell had a ringside seat as history was being made.
I went with him to Cairo 3 times, and to Quebec twice, once to Moscow, and also to Yalta. So you see, my claim to be the luckiest young woman in all the world is well supported.
She was also in on one of World War II's best-kept secrets.
The British group all knew that Mr. Roosevelt was in a wheelchair.
She also observed the tensions among the big three.
He saw that Stalin was moving over to Roosevelt and was paying no more attention to him. And so he felt out of it.
They meet in Tehran with Stalin, and the US Embassy doesn't have the facilities to accommodate the president. My grandfather said, well, come and stay with me at the British Embassy. No, thanks, said FDR. I'm staying with my friend Uncle Joe. There were several such, for my grandfather, very humiliating rebuffs.
At the Tehran conference in late '43, the big three set a date for the invasion of Normandy. The march to victory was on, but Churchill could see new problems.
Stalin is planning to create a brand new empire out of Europe with the Soviet Red Army at its throat and at its heart. And that was what really bothered my grandfather. It didn't seem to have bothered FDR at all.
There's probably no head of state who so often visits the troops.
He liked it, and he might be on a warship and they'd suddenly lose him and think he'd gone overboard. They'd find him down in the engine room talking to the men.
He wanted to be there at D-Day.
Of course he did, because he could relate to the soldiers. He'd been one himself.
In the end, it took King George VI himself to keep Churchill off the beaches and safe. But the king wasn't always around.
There's a story about him going up to the roof to...
The story is, and I'm not quite sure which building it was, but he went up on the roof.
And it was cold. And so Mrs. Churchill sent up a message to say, please, Winston, go downstairs now. But he said, no, I've got my warm coat on and I've got my hat on. And I found a nice warm place to sit and I'm not going down.
Suddenly the whole of the building started to smoke below.
An official came rushing up to the roof. We can't think what's going on. The place is full of smoke.
He was sitting on the chimney and so the smoke couldn't get out.
No wonder he felt so nice and warm.
Perhaps Winston's warmest day came in early May 1945.
I was on duty that evening, the 8th of May. When I went in for dictation, he said, good evening, Miss Layton, which he never did as a rule. Well, the war's over. You've played your part. Now, who could ever forget that?
Marvellous speech he made. This is your victory. In all our days, we've never known a greater day than this.
Advance, Britannia. Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
With World War II barely over, Churchill comes to America to warn of a new threat. That's next on War Stories. July 1945, as Britain basked in the Allied victory in Europe, a general election left 70-year-old Winston Churchill wondering, would he be allowed to lead the country in peacetime?
Few people could imagine that after bringing the war in Europe to a victorious conclusion, that he would be booted out.
But he was. Churchill's Conservative Party agenda was roundly rejected, and Labour swept the election. In a stunning defeat, 62-year-old Clement Attlee became Prime Minister.
We could hardly believe it, because there had been thousands of people turning out to thank him and cheer him and bless him.
My grandmother's comment was, "My dear, perhaps it is a blessing in disguise." Certainly very effectively disguised, was my grandfather's riposte. But my grandmother was right. He had poured out his lifeblood and energy in defeating Adolf Hitler, and he was exhausted.
As Clementine stayed behind to prepare Chartwell, a gloomy Winston flew to Italy for a much-needed vacation. By the end of the month, a well-rested Churchill had painted 15 canvases and was back at Chartwell burning the midnight oil, writing his war memoirs.
By 1946, he was effectively bankrupt because for the previous 6 or 7 years, he had been unable to write any books, he'd been unable to lecture, and therefore he was faced with the prospect of having to sell his beloved home.
The fact that the man who'd helped save Britain from the Nazis was teetering on bankruptcy outraged Churchill's friends. A newspaper publisher, William Barry, offered the cash-strapped Churchill £50,000 for Chartwell.
He corralled other wealthy well-wishers and purchased Chartwell from him on the understanding that my grandparents would live there till the end of their days.
Did he miss being involved in the momentous events of World War II?
Oh no, he was leader of his party, leader of the opposition, played a major part in bringing on young talent, and of course giving his wonderful lectures in the United States, working very closely with Truman, understanding that Truman understood the Soviet danger.
By March of 1946, Churchill was doing all he could to warn everybody of the Soviet danger. That month, President Harry Truman invited Churchill to make a speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Again, he was telling everyone, telling the world what they didn't want to hear. That was the beginning of the Cold War.
The purpose of Fulton was to beg the United States not to make the mistake that it had done in the 1920s of turning its back on Europe.
Once again, a Churchill warning caused considerable controversy. Some members of Parliament called for his censure. Ironically, his former ally, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, labeled him a warmonger. Back home at Chartwell, Churchill continued to work on his memoirs.
He had a dream in 1947 that his father came to him and they were discussing what had happened in the world since his father's death.
But it never quite got up to the moment when he could become Prime Minister. So the dream ended before he was able to tell his father that he'd actually made quite a success and hadn't been the failure his father had predicted.
Churchill once joked, "I'm prepared to meet my maker. Whether my maker is prepared for the great ordeal of meeting me is another matter." When War Stories returns, the final days of Sir Winston Churchill. During the late 40s, Chartwell hummed with activity as Churchill continued to work on his war memoirs. But he still managed to find time for his grandchildren, including young Winston.
Did you have a sense for the greatness of your grandfather?
I think if anybody had said to me, "What does your grandfather do?" I might well have replied, "He's a bricklayer," because if the weather was nice, we would spend 2 or 3 very happy hours each afternoon while he laid bricks, completing his large wall around his immense vegetable garden.
His grandchildren were probably the only people who took him completely for granted. We were really oblivious to anything except the fact that he was Grandpapa.
But Grandpapa was also the leader of Britain's Conservative Party, a fixture at the podium. Churchill continued to speak out on world events, especially on the threat of communism. And he couldn't resist when once again destiny knocked on his door. 25 October 1951. At age 76, Winston Churchill became Britain's Prime Minister for a second time.
It was an exciting night, and I remember staying up late and when the results were coming in, and the whole family was very thrilled.
Clementine told a friend that she knew it would be, quote, uphill work, but added her husband has a willing, eager heart.
He shouldn't have come back. I mean, he was an old man, for God's sake. He was 20 years older than most people draw their old age pension. And it wasn't a great period for him as Prime Minister. He was really interested only in international affairs and in trying to persuade the Russians not to go ahead with this nuclear arms race.
Despite the gloom surrounding his second term, there were some bright spots. In 1953, he was knighted by the Queen and received the Nobel Prize for Literature. But as he approached 80, the old lion's age was clearly catching up to him.
He's getting to be an old man already. And he was failing, quite clearly.
Lord Peter Carrington served as a parliamentary secretary in Churchill's government.
But he was still magical. He had this magical personality.
In June of '53, he suffered a stroke. As he recovered at Chartwell, the public was told he was suffering from exhaustion.
He was quite ill. And I think those around him became rather frustrated that he didn't resign.
His health deteriorating, Churchill finally did resign on 5 April 1955. At Chartwell, he continued to paint and occasionally ventured out on his friend Aristotle Onassis' yacht. As the 1960s unfolded, an increasingly fragile Churchill withdrew from public life. And on 10 January 1965, he suffered a devastating second stroke.
His last days. Did you see him often in those times?
We used to go every day to visit my grandfather. And we knew that it was inevitable. There were 10 long days. And he was very peaceful. He was lying in his bed, asleep, with his marmalade cat curled up beside him. It was sad, but it wasn't tragic, because he'd had enough.
2 weeks later, exactly 70 years to the day of his father's death, Sir Winston Churchill died. He was 90.
What were Winston Churchill's greatest gifts?
Undoubtedly courage.
Such are the atrocities against which we are in arms.
Both physical and moral courage.
His greatest vice or failing?
Impatience when things went wrong, impatience with people.
People can throw stones at him for being impatient, for being demanding. But we who worked personally for him grew to love him most truly.
He saved this country. I don't think that anybody else could have done what he did at that time. And for that, I'm eternally grateful, and he's my great hero.
When War Stories returns, a farewell fit for a king.
Tell me about the funeral.
It was a bitterly cold January day with a biting northeasterly wind. The streets lined with so many people. To be in St. Paul's with the singing of the battle hymn of the Republic in acknowledgement of the fact that he was half American. There were crowds gathered, children waving, and the old soldiers standing smartly to attention, saluting. It was an incredible moment of emotion and love.
It wasn't a funeral, it was a triumph. And his life was a triumph, actually, because for all the heroism and adulation and everything else, he had a bloody tough life. And he was a tough man, you know, to last that long after that sort of endeavor. We will never see his like again, that's for sure.
Winston Churchill's life is perhaps best summed up by his own words. In 1941, as Britain battled extinction at the hands of Hitler and the Nazis, Churchill offered these words of advice: never give in. Never, 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 never. In nothing great or small, large or petty, never give in except to convictions of honor and good sense. Never yield to force. Never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. His is a war story that deserves to be told. I'm Oliver North. Good night.